Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Zander, for meeting with me today and talking about your upcoming discussions at the CWI. I greatly appreciate you being here.
No problem. I'm happy to be here. Great to talk to you, Wesley.
Thank you. Likewise. So we'll just jump right into one of your talks, which is titled "Political Generals John Pope and George McClellan." So can you speak a little bit more as to what your talk will be about, and then we'll get into the weeds a little bit more.
Sure. I think this is the dine-in conversation. So it's going to be a lot of fun to have a table of CWI participants to kind of chat about. Two buckaroos, I would say, who get a good laugh every time you mention their name, George McClellan and John Pope. So I always try to pick winners when I'm thinking about what topics I want to bring to the table. But I'm really interested in Pope and McClellan as foils to each other, right? McClellan, the kind of classic Democrat who wants to wage a very conservative war just to save the Union and gets on Lincoln's nerves in the process and about half of Congress, all while he's doing that. And then John Pope, who's a pretty radical Republican in terms of Civil War generals. He comes from a family that had known Lincoln for a long time. His dad had been a judge in Illinois when Lincoln was a lawyer there. And he very quickly embraces a war that he thinks should include emancipation. It's a much more kind of progressive vision of the conflict, which he starts doing as early as 1861 in Missouri and brings it with him to Virginia. And these two then have to cooperate to try and bring the campaign of Second Manassas to some kind of successful conclusion for the Union. And of course, we all know that they don't manage to do that. McClellan sort of dawdles at Alexandria, doesn't send the troops that Pope needs. Pope, in his kind of haste to defeat Stonewall Jackson, completely loses track of James Longstreet for much of the campaign, something we've all been, we've all done in the past, of course, and losing an entire wing of the Army of Northern Virginia. But I'm just really interested in how these two kind of come to this clash in the summer of 1862, just as the Lincoln government is actually seriously considering, we know for the first time, turning emancipation into a war aim. And Lincoln has the preliminary proclamation ready to go. And Pope doesn't manage to give him the victory he needs. And he has to, of course, wait until September in the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam to issue his preliminary proclamation. So it's a super important summer. I think the campaign of Second Bull Run often gets lost in the kind of grand sweep of kind of Virginia Civil War history in that summer. We know a great deal about the 7 days. And then we know a great deal about Antietam. And this kind of battle at Second Manassas gets lost in this kind of grand kind of interchange. I think in part because Pope makes such a mess of it. The punchline, of course, is he's exiled to North Dakota, of all places, because he was so incompetent in command of an army in Virginia. But I'm just kind of really interested in this moment in the summer of 1862, where these political conversations and the politics of officers, which is a very unique thing about the American Civil War, that the officers in the Army were so openly political. I'm really excited to talk that through with the CWI's participants.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then can you speak a little bit more towards the panel you're on about debating Joseph Johnston?
Yeah, another great punchline. I think, as I said, though I will sort of suggest that Dr. Carmichael is to blame here. I think he knows that I spent a lot of my time thinking about Braxton Bragg, and he thought he was giving me a break by letting me think about Joseph Johnston for a little while. Johnston's such a fascinating character. Again, I think often viewed as a thorn in the side of everyone that really mattered, from Robert E. Lee to Jefferson Davis. Nobody gets along particularly well with Joe Johnston. I've been thinking about Johnston a lot in terms of kind of his importance in helping to craft the kind of narrative of the Civil War in its early years. He gets his memoir out in 1874, which is quite early for a lot of even Confederate generals. He beats most of the Union officers to the punch when his memoir comes out. And so I think he also plays a significant role in kind of shaping the history of the war and the way we understand it in a way that's perhaps been underappreciated by historians. So I've been going back and reading kind of through some of the things that Johnston has to say. And most importantly, he gets his narrative of the surrender at Bennett Place out a full decade before William Tecumseh Sherman's second volume of his memoirs appears. And so we have 10 years where Johnston basically gets to control the narrative of that surrender and what happened in Durham in that kind of late April moment in 1865. And so it's just a really interesting kind of way to think about history. Of course, we know that Sherman's handling of that surrender came in for a lot of criticism in Washington. Stanton actually has to send Grant down there to bring it to a resolution. But I think we forget that Johnston was negotiated from a position of a lot greater strength than Lee was. Johnston's army wasn't pinned by Sherman the way Lee's army had been pinned by Grant. And so Johnston came kind of meeting thinking he could get a lot more out of Sherman than Lee probably believed he could get out of Grant. And so I'm kind of really interested in that moment. And my thinking on Johnston at the moment is really about kind of what he says in those memoirs and the ways in which he helps to perhaps really shape and craft the narrative of the Civil War in the kind of immediate decade following the conflict.
That's fascinating. Do you see the professional historiography following a similar trend and sort of the course being corrected, or it's
a good question. I was thinking there hasn't really been a major biography of Johnston. I don't think in either of our lifetimes. He's kind of not terribly interesting to historians. There's been a biography of Bragg more recently than there has been of Johnston. I think he could really kind of come in for a reconsideration. It'd be interesting to see if anyone else on the panel, any of my fellow historians, think that they would want to take that project on. I think Johnston's tricky because he's in multiple different theaters. It's a lot harder for a historian to kind of follow him through the war the way it's easy to follow someone like a Longstreet, who Professor Elizabeth Varon has a biography coming out in October. But if Longstreet can get a solid reconsideration from a sterling historian, I think Johnston certainly deserves it. And I'm not going to write it, but I hope that somebody kind of takes up that mantle and kind of looks at Johnston again. I think we also kind of as a field have moved on from a lot of studies of the Confederacy. There's a great kind of new wave of work on union and unionism, which is wonderful and we've needed for a long time. But I think sometimes we all kind of get so distracted following kind of one thing that we leave behind the other. And these kind of internal divisions in the Confederacy and the ways in which the Confederate military high command really kind of shot itself in the foot time and time again is worth still continuing to think about as we try and figure out kind of how the Confederates kind of fumbled this opportunity that they had. When I was an undergraduate, our professor always told us the Confederates had a far better chance of winning the Civil War than the Patriots had of winning the American Revolution. But they kind of fumbled that football. Johnston's a big part of that story. So I'm be really interested to kind of see if the historiography ever really picks up on that. And it'll be interesting to talk about it. I'm excited especially for the audience to weigh in, because I know CWI's participants will have lots of thoughts about Joe Johnston, and I hope a few jokes as well.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure there'll be, at least Dr. Carmichael will have a few.
Yeah, that's right.
So many of the talks and discussions that you'll be involved in are centering around these sort of big name figures. They're generals. They're heavily involved. Could you speak a little bit towards what drew you to that specifically? What's drawn you in your work to these political higher ups who are having such an influence on the field more generally, especially as we've seen so much social history and the push from bottom up in recent decades?
Right. Yeah. So it's a good question. Probably because I'm a contrarian at heart. No, I sort of so appreciate the people who study the kind of granular level of the war. My own work, kind of the book that I just finished writing, is about really high-level politicians and military officers. So I wrote a book about anti-militarism in the Civil War era, and in particular, how the Republican Party articulates an anti-army political philosophy. And so these are the guys I kind of work with on a day-to-day basis, these big names. I think there's also maybe something to be said for the fact that I completed my PhD work in the COVID kind of 2-year period where archives were closed. You couldn't go kind of get into see the kind of papers of ordinary kind of Civil War participants, but a lot of the generals and political leaders, their papers have been digitized. And so you could sit at home and still be COVID safe and kind of do that research. So though I hadn't kind of thought about it before, maybe part of the reason my project got shaped that way and my interests were shaped that way was because that was the kind of resources that I had. I kind of had to adapt what I was doing to kind of fit the time. There's also, I think, probably something to be said for the fact that I grew up in the West. I grew up in Colorado. Spent most of my summers driving around with my parents to various history sites kind of in the Western United States. And a lot of those tend to be military sites, in particular, kind of dealing with the Indian Wars and the Western Army after the Civil War. And so I came to know people like Sherman and Custer and Sheridan as Western officers before I knew them as Civil War officers. And I think a lot of my interests have been defined by trying to better understand what I learned about all of these officers as Western figures after the war, what they did during the Civil War, and kind of forging connections between those two things. I think that is what really kind of lies underneath a lot of the work that I do. I'm just really interested in kind of that longer arc, that longer narrative story of how do we get from this sort of massive Civil War to then this process of Western expansion. And those key figures, those big names are part of it. A lot of the ex-Confederates, of course, are part of it as railroad engineers and financiers and capitalists, whereas the big name Union Army guys stay in the Army and they're directing the wars that follow in the wake of the Civil War. And that's probably a rambling answer to your question, but I think that, that's probably kind of in my own work why I'm drawn to these kind of figures.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. I appreciate that. So with these two different talks, give us just a brief vignette about either one, just get the viewers even more excited about what you're going to be speaking on, perhaps something that's less well known.
Sure. That's a good question. I'm sort of some of the sources that I've given for the luncheon talk, the talk about Pope and McClellan. One of them is Pope's testimony before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which is a really fascinating body of politicians who decide with absolutely no military experience and really no idea what it takes to lead an army, that they're going to haul up the most important military figures who are in the midst of waging a civil war. But, I guess Congress figures they have time to come in and sit in Washington for a day and justify their decisions. I think the Joint Committee is such a fascinating kind of body in our understanding of the war. Bruce Tapp has written a wonderful book about them. That's really the only book about the Joint Committee that exists. And Pope's testimony before the Joint Committee is pretty pointed. He really attacks McClellan. He goes after McClellan's slowness. Says that on the peninsula, McClellan dawdled. He could have moved against Richmond more quickly, which of course is true, and we all know that. But the fact that even in just a few weeks after the kind of conclusion of the Peninsula campaign, that Pope would stand up before Congress and say that really shows there's a lot of tension in the Union High Command, that these guys aren't cooperating all of the time. And I think what that speaks to, that kind of vignette of Pope standing up in front of Congress and openly criticizing his fellow Army officers, is there was a lot more dissension within the Union and a lot more debate about how the war ought to be waged than historians have really accounted for. And the fact that the United States was able to overcome that once they get, of course, in 1864, two really key guys in place, that is Grant in the East and Sherman in the West, but they really have to kind of stumble to that conclusion. And there's kind of a lot of false starts on the way to that of people who can't quite get it right. And the reason Grant is so successful, I think many historians would say, is because he's apolitical. He's not making these political declarations. He's saying Lincoln's running the country, I'll run the war, and Lincoln and Grant can agree that they can kind of leave each other alone. They trust each other enough. But until Grant shows up, there isn't a great deal of trust between politicians and Army officers. The other thing Pope constantly talks about in that testimony is how much better the Western soldiers were than the Eastern soldiers, which is not, I think, a very smart thing to do if you're about to take command of a bunch of Eastern soldiers. But this is why Pope is considered such a joke, right? He issues this famous order where he says headquarters in the saddle. I have come to you from the West where we have only seen the backs of our enemies, and all his soldiers just must be rolling their eyes thinking, who's this guy? What has he ever done? He hasn't faced Robert E. Lee, this kind of conversation. And of course, the Confederates just can't help but make fun of Pope when he loses. They said, he had his headquarters where his hindquarters should be. There's a great song that they reference, which it comes up in my work. One of my favorite Pope stories. He's sent to West Texas in the 1850s to dig wells to find water underground on the Llano Estacado, which is the staked high plains of West Texas. He's sent out there by Jefferson Davis, who's the Secretary of War at the time, ostensibly to find water so you can build a railroad. You need water for steam engines, and you want to build a railroad across Texas if you're a slaveholder, because that's better for slavery. So Pope is sent out there to drill like 200-foot wells into the West Texas desert to try and find water. And he can't find any, and he becomes a laughingstock in the army. It wasn't his idea. He was sent out there by Davis, but Pope kind of becomes the fall guy. And Porter Alexander, who always has a good kind of jibe for anyone, says that there was a song in the old army about Pope that went something like, Pope told a flattering tale that proved to be bravado of the streams that spout like ale on the Llano Estacado. And that everybody knew that in the war, and they all just thought Pope was kind of a joke. And I think there's probably something to the fact that Pope was maybe seen as semi-incompetent, but he was also really frustrating. And I guess the last kind of part of this vignette about Pope, Robert E. Lee does not use particularly harsh language very often when he's talking about his opponents. He is harder on Pope in the way that he talks about him than any other officer, Union Army officer, he encounters during the war. And the reason for this is that Pope really got under his skin. Pope's orders about kind of promoting emancipation, refusing to protect Confederate property, letting his soldiers kind of loose in the Shenandoah Valley, really rankled Lee. And he refers to Pope as a miscreant, which to us is not a very kind of strong word, but in the 19th century, that was a pretty heavy insult. Like you were kind of the lowest of the low if you were referred to as a miscreant. And so Lee takes a harder sort of tack against Pope than any other commander, which I think maybe to Pope's credit shows that he was making some headway. He was getting somewhere with his ideas. He just didn't have the military competency to back up his political thinking. Didn't help that he had like Irvin McDowell and Nathaniel Banks helping him, but he just couldn't kind of pull it off. But he's just this kind of very funny figure who enters the Civil War briefly, kind of in this summer of 1862, the real kind of war. Some people hate me for saying that, but the kind of Virginia theater, sure. Just ever so briefly, and then kind of fades away in North Dakota, in Minnesota. I will say that in 1864, he does ask Abraham Lincoln if he can invade Canada. And Lincoln is like, no, we're done. It's not gonna happen. I'm busy with the Confederates. But I just find Pope very funny. He's always got an idea. And there's always a good story to be told about him.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the historiography on McClellan has been fleshed out so much more thoroughly than it has on Pope. Has that been difficult to wrestle with as you're preparing to discuss this more fully?
Yeah, it's really hard. Pope's one of these guys. He writes, he leaves behind a partial memoir, which Peter Cousins edited for UNC Press, a few letters. He writes the history of the Second Manassas Campaign for Charles Scribner's Battles and Leaders of the Century Magazine Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series. But that's really his extant writings on the war. Again, he after the war stays in the Army, he becomes the kind of general in charge of the Department of the Missouri. He's in charge of much of the post-Civil War West under Sherman and Sheridan. And he's busy. So he doesn't take a lot of time leaving behind papers writing about his experiences in the war. McClellan writes a memoir, McClellan's own story, which I love that he titles it in the third person, because of course he does.
Absolutely.
Like Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott's memoirs are also written Winfield Scott's memoirs. General Scott walked to Mexico City. Really, Winfield, like that's. But McClellan left letters, of course, which, is his wife's final revenge. She had to sit there during the Civil War and receive every letter he ever wrote, in which he talked about how every battle he fought was a masterpiece of art. And she just put them to the side and said, when he dies, I'm going to publish these and everyone's going to know what I had to put up with. But there's way more material on McClellan, is the kind of point. He also ran for president, which is fascinating and horrifying to consider that had he won, he'd be on the $5 bill. And that's upsetting. So there's just less material on Pope, and that makes it hard. It's hard to kind of get inside Pope's head in the same way that you can get inside McClellan's head. I understand Pope much better, again, as a sort of thinker about the postbellum West, which he wrote about extensively in annual reports and things for the War Department, than I do as a Civil War leader. So yeah, I'd say that is frustrating, but it's also kind of really revealing of kind of who history picks and chooses as its important kind of figures. So there's one biography of Pope by Peter Cousins. There's a second biography, which is kind of a hagiographical defense of Pope that's really not worth reading. And then Richard Ellis, who was a historian in the 1960s, wrote a book about Pope and Indian policy, but that's about it for the literature on Pope. And Cousins' biography, as much of his work, is super readable and very thorough, but it really doesn't take any kind of big leaps in terms of the way that it interprets Pope or his conduct during the war. Again, someone who would probably be well served by a new biography. I think Dr. Bill Marvell's recent book about Fitzjohn Porter also kind of has something to say about Pope, because Pope makes Porter the fall guy for the failure at Second Manassas, because he knows that Porter is an acolyte of George McClellan's. And so I think as we start to unravel kind of that dynamic and that political fight, which, I'm hoping that the CWI participants will do a lot of my work for me at the luncheon and give me all their good ideas, because I trust they've thought about it a great deal as well. I think Pope deserves kind of a new look. Again, I don't know if I'm the one to do it, but I find him really, really fascinating. I mean, not just because I also has spent a good deal of time in North Dakota, and maybe I feel a particular, sympathy or empathy for Pope in that regard. But no, I think you've pointed to, exactly the problem. But when you don't have sources in their own hand, you don't have their own kind of interior thoughts. It's quite a bit harder to kind of get to grips with them in a biography. Not that I want to write a biography of McClellan. Spending a decade reading George McClellan's thoughts about George McClellan, I think might be considered cruel and unusual punishment by most American courts. So
I don't think that's far off. Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Zander, for speaking with me today. I know I'm very excited to talk with you at the conference more about all this, and
great. Yeah,
our viewers are as well.
Thanks, Wesley. Looking forward to meeting you in June.
Thank you. Likewise.